Hi there and welcome back to First Edition Live. We're coming to you live from the Guardian's offices in King's Cross, London. We're here for a discussion about the latest developments in Ukraine with our expert guests Emma Graham-Harrison and Nigel Gould-Davies.
We'll give them proper introductions in a couple of moments, but first, Nimo and I are going to give you a very quick rundown of the day's headlines.
We'd love to hear from you, so please do send us your questions either in the comment section below or on Twitter using the hashtag FELive. So let's begin with today's 5 big stories at 7 p.m. UK time.
First, in Moscow, after a week of sham referendums, Vladimir Putin will sign treaties on Friday annexing territories in occupied Ukraine. Putin has already indicated that he is prepared to defend those territories using all available means, including a nuclear strike.
Meanwhile, in Sweden, authorities have reported a 4th leak on one of the 2 Nord Stream pipelines that are believed to have been the subject of sabotage this week. Russia and NATO have blamed each other for the damage to the pipelines.
In the UK, Liz Truss has insisted that she will not change course on the economy despite the Bank of England's emergency £65 billion intervention to protect pension funds. In a series of interviews today on local TV and radio stations, Truss said that eventually people would feel the benefit of her policies.
In health news, a major review of nicotine products has found that vaping is substantially less harmful than smoking. But the study also found that 2/3 of smokers believe vaping is just as bad for you, or even worse than having a cigarette.
And in chocolate rabbit news, Lidl has been ordered to destroy its rabbit-shaped chocolates after Lindt successfully sued it for a breach of copyright. Lidl has been told it can melt down the chocolate and reuse it. So there is an awful lot going on, but for today's discussion, and like in the newsletter, we're going to go in depth on one big story, and today that's going to be about the future of the war in Ukraine.
And while that's always an urgent subject, events of the last few weeks, from Ukraine's advances to Putin's sham referendums, it feels like the beginning of a new phase of the conflict. To talk about all of that, we're joined today by Emma Graham-Harrison and Nigel Gould-Davies.
Emma is a senior international affairs correspondent for The Guardian and The Observer, and she's reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Zimbabwe, China, probably quite a long list of other countries as well. She returned from her most recent trip to Ukraine at the end of August, and she's written a lot of memorable and important pieces since the war began, which have got her banned from Russia, although I don't know if Vladimir Putin is personally responsible for that or not.
We're also joined by Nigel, who is a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and formerly the UK's ambassador to Belarus. Before that, he spent 4 years at the British Embassy in Moscow. He's written extensively about the war in Ukraine since it began, and he recently said that the events of the last few weeks have been the most significant moment since Russia failed to take Kyiv in the first days of its invasion. So let's start there. So Emma, by now, most people are probably more aware of Ukraine's remarkable success in Kharkiv in recent weeks. Where do things stand today? So just where have things gone to in the last couple of weeks?
Well, you've had this dramatic military success by Ukraine that, as Nigel said, has sort of been the most important moment in the war militarily, really, since Russia gave up or was pushed back from Kyiv and gave up its attempts to take the capital. Ukraine's military has liberated over 3,000 square kilometres, I'm going to get my units wrong, of Ukrainian territory. And in response, we've seen Russia speed up its plans to hold these fake referendums. It's held them. Absolutely no one was surprised that they came back overwhelmingly in support of, we should say, joining Russia, and Putin has pushed ahead with sort of that legal process to annex these four regions. And what that allows Putin to do is to recast the war domestically as not a war of offence, but a war of defence. It's as a result of that, he's issued these mobilization orders, calling up hundreds of thousands of Russian men, not just young Russian men. We've seen people mobilized all the way up to the age of 60, people, not in good health, not good physical condition. We've seen these extraordinary scenes, Russians voting with their feet at the border, desperate not to be part of this war. As yet unconfirmed, but pretty damning reports from inside Russia of the equipment list that these conscripts have been given, required to buy their own sleeping bags, even their own body armour, apparently. And, most worryingly of all, we've seen Putin saying that he will use everything at Russia's disposal, which includes its nuclear arsenal, to defend Russian territory, which, according to him, not recognised by really anyone else in the world, but according to him now includes quite a large part of Ukraine. The bit that they're laying claim to is larger than Hungary or Portugal. To give you an idea, it represents about 15% of Ukraine's territory. So this is a very serious, land grab. I think some experts, Nigel can probably help, have said it's the biggest annexation of territory in Europe since World War II.
And before we get, that's an excellent overview of the events of recent weeks. Before we get into it in detail, do you have a sense of whether, is that period of rapid advance by the Ukrainian forces come to an end? Does it feel like the lines are settling into a more kind of static position at the moment than they have been in recent weeks? Nigel?
Okay, yes. So this sudden and dramatic advance, and it really is, I think, the most significant phase of the war since the early days, has shown just how unpredictable the war has been. There have been several narratives since the invasion. None of them has really settled down for very long before it's been disrupted by new realities. So any predictions at this stage have to be tentative. But clearly the Ukrainians have their tails up now. The reports about the poor morale of the Russian forces they've encountered, and these are not yet the conscripts, these are the professional military, their morale is shot. Their equipment turns out to be very inadequate. Russia's been outthought as well as outfought in this operation. All the signs are that Ukraine is emboldened now, and other times and places show that you can get these sort of sudden cumulative collapses of lines. So no one can predict the future, but Ukraine has great incentives now to push its advantage while Russia is still undertaking this massive mobilization before it can get more forces into the field. So look more around that northeast area. But also there's a second operation taking place around Kherson as well that has begun to make progress. So we could see more.
And could you speak a bit about what the events of the last few weeks have shown us about the role of Western and Russian intelligence, and how it seems like one of the stories of what's happened is that there has been a really successful deployment of American resources to advise and support the Ukrainian forces. On the other hand, Russia sort of failed to see or was unable to respond quickly to what was going on. Is that true? And how do you assess what's happened in terms of intelligence the last few weeks?
I think partly the success of this operation can be attributed to a very successful deception operation that Ukraine itself perpetrated. But your point is important too. The Russians failed to realize what was really happening. And we know that the West has been providing not only practical military help in terms of very significant and sophisticated equipment now, and more on its way, but also intelligence and helping Ukraine to target Russian vulnerabilities effectively. So that is very significant. Putin has complained vocally and angrily about that, in fact. And just as in the lead up to the war itself, the United States and Britain took the decision to share a great deal about the intelligence they had found and about Russia's build-up, so they're helping Ukraine operationally now.
Uh-huh.
And Emma, I think this is one part of this which is like slightly underreported within the context of everything else that's been going on, is the effect this is all having on Ukraine's economy. Despite the aid that it's receiving, how much longer can it keep the semblance of a normal economy while still operating the war like this?
Well, I think that's a very good point, because obviously you need to keep, wars are expensive. Ukraine's getting a lot of support in terms of weaponry from the West, but it's still having to buy its own. People need to feed themselves, and when you talk to people in Ukraine, it was not that prosperous a country even before the war started. A lot of people were living paycheck to paycheck, and a lot of businesses have gone under, in some cases because they've been bombed, they've been literally destroyed, in other cases because the owners have fled, in other cases because they can no longer get the raw materials, in other cases obviously very perhaps most prominently, that there's been sort of Russian interference, the mass sort of capture of grain stores, the blockage of, now somewhat lifted, but, of normal export flows. So, yeah, the economy has been very, very badly hit. And, there are calls from within Ukraine for a kind of Marshall Plan. And, Ukraine has warned actually since the very beginning of, the Ukrainian government has warned from the very beginning of this war that they need support economically as well as militarily, and that without that they will not be able to win this war, that they need help to keep the economy going. I don't know if you had something to add, Nigel.
Absolutely right. It reminds us that this war is being fought on two fronts. One is by military means on the battlefield, and the other is by economic means on the home fronts of the respective participants. And normally when we think about that, we focus on Western sanctions against Russia and Russia's manipulation of gas supplies to Europe. But of course, Ukraine, by a long way, is the worst economically and financially hit by this. And it's really important that as part of a total Western response to this, that, for example, the IMF step up and provide Ukraine with the support that it needs, and prevents Russia, in effect, suffocating the Ukrainian economy as part of its effort to ensure that time works on Russia's side rather than against Russia.
And I was going to say, just to give you one example of the type of challenges, Ukraine needs glass at the moment because of the bombings. But many windows have been shattered. Winter is coming. It's a country where winters are brutally cold. Almost all of Russia's glass used to be imported, almost all of Ukraine's glass used to be imported from Russia. That's obviously no longer an option. You make glass by melting sand, which requires huge amounts of energy. Energy prices have gone up anyway. Ukraine has a particular problem because so much of its energy supplies still come from Russia. And so you have a sort of combination of an economic problem and also a humanitarian problem where people are facing a winter that's, if your business doesn't have windows, it's not going to operate. If your house doesn't have windows, you're going to be very cold, perhaps dangerously so. So, there's a lot of overlap between sort of the economic problems, the humanitarian problems, and sort of where how the war is disrupting people's lives.
Putin knows this. You can no longer defeat Ukraine in the field, but he can continue to impose pain. Mm-hmm. And we saw in response to the offensive in Kharkiv, for example, the use of rocket strikes against civilian infrastructure and energy targets in particular, as winter is approaching, to exacerbate that sort of kind of pain.
I suppose all of that means there is, as well as a kind of a, moral and sort of disincentivizing case for Russia in restoring Ukraine, there's also a case for showing other democracies in the region that it's safe to be a democracy and to remain outside of Russia's orbit.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I worry that any kind of compromise that would leave Russia better off than it was before the invasion would be demoralizing for precisely that reason. It would show that authoritarian, unprovoked aggression is essentially rewarded rather than punished. And that would make other countries in the region immediately less secure.
And I think not just in the region. I mean, I think you can draw a pretty strong line between what happened in Syria, Russia's ability to intervene in that war with relative impunity, particularly the ability to normalize essentially the use of chemical weapons in conflict. Obama's famous red line, which he failed to enforce. I think it's almost certain that gave Putin the confidence, not only to proceed with this invasion of Ukraine, but also in the context of also other acts of aggression in Ukraine, Georgia, and across the region, but also perhaps to consider making a nuclear threat. If you've already overturned one massive taboo, and chemical weapons, since the First World War, the use of chemical weapons had been a massive taboo. If you were a dictator looking at what happened to dictators who use chemical weapons, even if you didn't care for your civilian population at all, you probably, before 2015, would have come to the conclusion that you would pay a very, very high price, and perhaps it wasn't worth it. You look at what happened in Syria, where chemical weapons are generally most effective against a civilian population, not on a military battlefield, in fact. And they were a very effective part of a campaign of terror and intimidation of civilians. And, you might conclude that perhaps you too would consider using chemical weapons because the throwback hasn't been so great. So I think, we're not just talking about the region, and we're not just talking about democracies either. We're talking about how dictators, how autocracies weigh up their decisions about, you know, what they can do within the international community. And, you know, further afield, you know, Russia's neighbour, China, almost certainly watching what's happening, how that's going down, you know, and considering their own territorial claims on a democracy in their political orbit.
So that's the situation in Ukraine. Let's kind of pivot to Putin's response, and you know, which started with that speech last week. Nigel, how would you characterise the response to the mobilization order in Russia?
This is one of the ways in which we're now entering a fundamentally different phase. Until now, most Russians could ignore the war and get on with their lives. It didn't directly affect them. Sanctions are beginning to take an effect, but that was chronic rather than acute and immediate. And now we have a situation where Putin has signed this decree. The decree makes no mention in the text of this being merely partial. And I think what we've already seen is something in practice that means far more than the supposed 300,000 reservists will be called up. All sorts of stories already about people who never had any military involvement being in short order being served their papers. So this is the point at which ordinary Russians in larger numbers have to take a view of this war, because now the state is not merely asking or cajoling or paying them to fight, it's saying you have to. It's a matter of life and death for very large numbers of people. And we've already seen in many regions civil unrest. It's still low level, it's still limited, but there is something in the air now. And as Emma mentioned earlier, people in large numbers fleeing to the borders. More are trying to leave the country than are being called up at this point. Yeah. So it does feel like a moment of truth that begins to put the regime under more strain and force people to ask harder questions about their country's future than any time during Putin's presidency.
Is it? Oh, sorry. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say on that note, you know, during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, around 15,000 Russian or then Soviet troops were killed. I mean, the numbers are a bit debated. Around 15,000 Russian troops died in the first 2 months, I think by March, in Ukraine. And if you think about, you know, that's considered a contributory factor to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, I think you can understand the potential, you know, when lives are being lost on that scale, the potential impact. I'm certainly not an expert on Russia, but, you know, through that lens of sort of how one loss resonates politically.
Yeah, and make no mistake, there's a reason why Putin waited 7 months to do this. He knows the potential political consequences of this. So he's done it late, he's done it reluctantly when he felt he had to, but doing it late, he is beginning mobilization in conditions that are far less advantageous, when a lot of the officer corps has already been killed, when the conditions for rapid mobilization just no longer exist. So it's a one more strategic blunder, but this puts strains on the system.
Is it possible to put, I mean, can you try to give people a sense of if 1 million Russians are potentially being mobilized, what does that mean for the typical town or village outside of the kind of big urban? I mean, will everybody in Russia sort of know people who are being mobilized and called up, or what's the sort of scale and impact just across the whole country? Do we have a sense of that?
There are already stories that in some of the more remote areas where ethnic minority non-Russians predominate, and it's from them disproportionately that Russians have already been sort of called up. Cases of all the men in the village, for example, being served their papers immediately, regional governors being told they have to fulfill requirements. So in some places that will be dramatically the case. In others less so. Moscow and St. Petersburg will be the last parts of the country from which we're likely to see the extension of conscription, because those are politically most significant and volatile, opposition-minded. But also, this is a country now where, for all of the severe media restrictions, there is still an information space, a virtual space. where people can, if they wish, find all sorts of information, stories, videos, and so on. These have already been circulated. So even if people don't know personally those who are affected, they will have ready access to lots and lots of stories and examples of people like them who have been called up. The implication is that they themselves can follow.
How is this kind of going to affect Russia's ability to actually recruit people if it's the scale of people who are trying to flee, if the level of, it's not as advantageous this year, people are not as willing to leave. How, if they can't hit those kinds of numbers that they're reportedly aiming for, what is going to happen both within Russia in terms of the regime, in terms of the Kremlin, but also in Ukraine and trying to get the military out there?
Yeah, so how much worse can it get? The next step to watch, and senior politicians in Russia are already talking about it, is closing the borders and making it impossible for fighting age men, and that can mean over 50 at this point. Again, Russia's pretty desperate. Prevent them from leaving the country so they can be pulled off the street or from their homes to fight. The freedom to leave the country is one of those post-Soviet freedoms that's not yet been clawed back. It was very difficult to leave the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's been very easy since then. And for all of the clamping down we see under Putin, that right has remained unchanged. So I think that's a canary in the coal mine. If people really feel there's no exit option now, they could be, again, served with their papers in short order, then that concentrates minds more insistently than ever. And it just goes to show how completely invested Putin is in this war. He really is putting all of his chips on that table, knowing that it could destabilize his regime. That is a mark of the strength of his obsession.
And that if you think about the Ukrainian military in comparison, when you were reporting in Ukraine, did you have a sense of, I mean, I think for people living in countries who've never experienced war or don't have any sense of what it's like, it's quite hard to kind of understand what it means to say their morale is high and therefore they're doing better. Can you talk about that in any sort of concrete terms about how that affects the ability to fight war effectively and if you saw any of that?
Well, I mean, perhaps I can tell you a story from just before the war. In fact, the day before the war in Kyiv, I was having lunch with Ole Sentsov, who's one of the leading film directors in Ukraine. He's got a new film that came out on, I think, 2 weeks before the war. So he could easily have been sort of, on the film's been going around the festival circuit, it's been at Cannes, at all these other places. There's certainly, it's clear this is a war on the economic front, on the military front. There's also very much a political war going on to ensure that Ukraine continues to get the military support that is essential to its ability to win. So, there's a role for prominent Ukrainians to be out there raising awareness. But he said to me, and he was a political prisoner for 5 years in Siberia, so he really had endured quite a lot already. And I said, if there is a war, it was still when people weren't sure what it would look like. He said, no, if there's a war, I'm going to be fighting. I've got a unit, I've got it lined up. And he's a really impressive artist. But he's also, I think, in his 50s. He's endured a lot. He's not he's not possibly not down at the gym every day. And I wasn't sure if this was just an expression of sort of patriotic sentiment or a real commitment, to be honest, because he's someone who could have been patriotic without doing that. Anyway. The war started about 2 or 3 days later when I sort of got my bearings. I checked in. He was already on the front line fighting. He's been injured. And I think, that shows you. Another friend of mine, a Ukrainian who spent most of his life as a civil servant, never been in the military. He went to the recruitment office the day the war started, was told to go home because so many people were trying to sign up that they were like, we need time to eat. We haven't even eaten all day. And he finally managed to join a unit about 2 months ago after finding his own body armour that somebody made in a repurposed factory and his own helmet that he got a friend from somewhere else to bring in for him because there's none left in Ukraine. So I think that degree of commitment, you see that on the Ukrainian side, and these are just 2 stories out of thousands that everyone's already heard. And then on the Russian side, you can see people saying, Ukrainians often say, if we stop fighting, there will be no Ukraine. If Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. And you see Russians are running for the border because they don't want to die in a war which they don't consider existential. And I think it's very hard to exactly put your finger on the role that morale plays. But, in my career, two of the biggest, especially the last couple of years, the two biggest conflicts I've been involved in reporting on have been Afghanistan and Ukraine. And, Afghanistan was a war that the West was convinced that it couldn't lose because of its technological advantages. And at the beginning of this conflict in Ukraine, you had a war that most people in the West and some in Ukraine were convinced that Ukraine couldn't win because of Russia's technological advantages. And I think in both of those cases, you can see, in Afghanistan, the collapse of the government and the takeover of the Taliban, and in Ukraine, the extraordinary success of the Ukrainian military, the importance that morale can play even when you're at a technological disadvantage.
And there's no sign, is there, that the mobilization has cowed morale or cowed Ukraine's willingness to fight? Or
I mean, if anything, the Ukrainian defense, the Ukrainian sort of cyber world's very good at sort of trolling memes, thing like that, and there's people have just been sort of saying, don't come and die here. The head of Ukraine's railways was sort of tweeting out, we're preparing some more trains to send Russians home as they deserve, and had pictures of the refrigerated morgue carriages that have been used to store the bodies of the many, many Russian dead. So, I think at the moment there's still very, I don't know if Nigel would contradict me, I don't think Ukrainians underestimate their enemy, but I think they also feel, clearly, as we've discussed, these are not crack troops who are going to be coming to, Ukraine, nor are they going to be people who particularly, or men, because I think they're all men who particularly want to be there.
Morale is incredibly important, including in contemporary warfare. If it were a contest of morale alone, then Ukraine would already have won a long time ago.
So the other thing about, we've been talking a bit about the mobilization order and the consequence of the speech. One of the other key parts of the speech was that it coincided with the order for these referenda. And I think tomorrow he's due to sign the annexation off formally. What do we know, and maybe this is a question for you first, Emma, but what do we know about how they've been conducted and kind of whether there is any semblance of meaningful democratic process there whatsoever?
I mean, I
just
think
soldiers and
we don't really need to detain ourselves on that. I think even Russia's very relatively staunch allies, they just haven't been recognised as legitimate by anybody at all. I think anyway, conducting any kind of democratic exercise in war is difficult. Russia doesn't even control half the territory it's claiming, so it couldn't even have so half the people it's claiming want to be annexed are under Ukrainian control and haven't even been asked. And the ones who have been asked, I don't think there's any semblance of democracy. Absolutely not there. Completely sham.
The answer's in the results: 99%, 97%, 98%.
Why don't they ever make up like a 70% result? I don't understand why that's not the obvious strategic thing to do. Like, why not make up a slightly more plausible figure?
And there's also, of course, the many stories. Again, an still information free, relatively free environment. Things can get out of videos of people being essentially forced to vote, people going around door to door with guns telling people to vote, flagrant violations of every conceivable kind. And these elections, so-called rightly, will be entirely unrecognised.
One of the most important parts of his address was about was his hint at nuclear war, the use of nuclear weapons in some capacity or another. Is there any evidence that that's impacted decisions made by Ukraine and their allies? Like, has his hints changed the course of anyone's decisions at this point?
It's the second time he's done this. The first time was when he announced the invasion on February the 24th. In barely veiled terms, warned that any country that hindered Russia's so-called special military operation would face unprecedented consequences. That didn't deter anyone at all. And what we've seen since then is not only Ukraine's astonishing resilience and ability to push back Russian forces, but escalating Western support in all the sorts of ways we were describing earlier. And Putin knows this. That's the interesting thing. Broadly speaking, it's the West and Ukraine more than Russia that has escalated, despite that threat. Ukraine has done some very audacious things, including attacks on Russian territory, attacks on occupied Crimea as well. So Putin is saying this again, and almost as if in recognition that the first warning didn't work, saying, and it's a sort of sign of weakness this time, this is not a bluff.
Yeah.
So, and to say it again and to say that is an acknowledgement of the lack of credibility. We know that a number of Western governments have privately sent warnings now to Moscow to say, don't use nuclear weapons. And there is an enhanced intelligence activity around monitoring the sorts of processes and sorts of places where preparation for this might be detected. But in terms of achieving Putin's objective of hindering, constraining, deterring, or dividing the West, no evidence whatsoever at this point.
And kind of similarly to that point, to Emma, like the kind of the point of the annexation is to kind of bring territory under what like Russia has called a nuclear umbrella. You know, would you expect that to change anything on the ground in these areas that Putin is claiming?
I mean, I think the only thing it really changes is how Putin is able to present this war sort of both domestically and internationally. You know, he can claim that he is no longer making a sort of imperialist bid to seize the territory of another country. He is defending Russia's territory. I mean, formally, you know, it's very disturbing from every possible perspective. You know, certainly from a nuclear point of view, you know, absolutely everything Nigel said, that the sort of frightening aspect to this, I think, is that Putin is clearly at a point where he's being very reckless. I mean, you said earlier, you can see from some of his behaviour that this is something that he is kind of has become an obsession. And if you look at a lot of the things he's done so far, they're not the actions of someone taking kind of calm and, you know, the decision to launch this all-out war in the first place. You know, talking of nuclear threats, the military behaviour around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which has been extremely reckless. And I think the issue when you get into sort of making nuclear bluffs and things like that, the concern is that you know, does Putin become even more reckless? Does he miscalculate? You know, I think that seems to be the concern. Not that anyone thinks it's likely to be imminent. Certainly, as you said, someone who says I'm not bluffing often is bluffing. But no, I mean, on the ground, I think, you know, Ukrainians will continue to fight for their territory.
You've written that he's sort of crossed this Rubicon quite recently into a path where there's no way out but through, as it were, sort of total war. But I just wonder, if you look back on your own time in Moscow, were the seeds? Did you have a sense, or did people in Moscow that you spoke to have a sense of him as somebody who would ultimately reach this kind of view, I mean, such a kind of extreme view of the world?
At that time, I don't think...
And that was when, sorry, you should...
In the mid-2000s, yeah. At that time, I think almost no one predicted that his personal journey could become quite so dark, that having seized the ring, this golem could become quite so monstrous. There were clear signs, I think, from very early on, though, that he had an agenda which a lot of people didn't recognize, that he was intrinsically authoritarian, that he was dissatisfied with the status quo, especially over Ukraine. Ukraine is a country he's been misunderstanding in one way or another for around 20 years or so. The story of my time in Moscow was this sort of paradox that, on the one hand, our trade and economic and financial relationship was exploding. There was an IPO pretty much every month in London. I remember I was heading the economic section. I was sort of looking after all of this. And it was a hopeful story that globalization would change Russia and reform it and make it willing to accept international rules and so on. But on the other hand, politically and in security terms, Russia was moving in the opposite direction, including with respect to Britain in particular. This was the time when Alexander Litvinenko was killed in London with the use of polonium-laced tea. So you had this contradiction opening up. So economics on the one hand, economics good and politics bad. And I was always skeptical that that was a stable combination. I always thought sooner or later the darker politics and the revisionist ambitions would ultimately trump the cooperative parts of our relationship. And so it came to pass, but even I didn't imagine he'd launch this essentially now all-out war in Europe.
So for our final section of the conversation, we're going to move on to how Russia is viewed around the world and in its allies and countries in the middle and in the West. And after that, we'll have some questions from watchers, listeners, readers, watchers. And yeah, if you could send them with the hashtag FELive, that would be great. But Emma, if we could start asking you, particularly, you mentioned this in passing before, but how the annexations have been viewed outside of Russia and Ukraine. Do you have a sense that that and other recent events have moved anybody's sort of camps? Has there been a shifting in the way that third countries view Russia in recent weeks?
Well, I think certainly in Russia's immediate orbit, it's had quite the opposite effect to what Putin would have wanted. I mean, you had sort of extraordinary scenes of, the Kazakh leader on the stage with Putin, to his face, refusing to acknowledge, the Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk People's Republic, these sort of sham independent statelets that preceded this annexation. And you've seen, I think, in the whole sort of, what Russia thinks of as its sphere of influence, all these countries that, had, like the West perhaps, been very much, in the shadow of this idea of Russian military might, essentially rethinking their position. I mean, they're now welcoming Russian refugees, essentially, from the draft, flooding into Central Asian countries. There's been, a lot of memes about, for a long time, people have been making an economic migration from those countries to Russia. I saw people were sort of making jokes about, Russians kind of coming to these countries that they'd looked down on for so long, people from sort of Central Asia. So I think certainly Russia has been diminished in its own sphere of influence. I think events are being watched very closely by other autocratic governments. I mean, particularly coming back to what we were talking about earlier, China, whether they're watching Putin's mistakes and considering what they might do were they to make a military bid for Taiwan. But they certainly seem unhappy. Putin said publicly that he said, China, we know you have questions and concerns about what's happening in Ukraine, which is a pretty strong admission of Chinese concerns about, presumably reckless nuclear threats and everything else that's sort of going on. So, I would say that it's a war that has certainly weakened Russia internationally and, at least for now, perhaps, shored up a little bit sort of the idea of democracies supporting each other and perhaps that there are some limits to what, the military ambition, certainly outside their own borders of autocratic countries. And just very briefly on sort of slightly on that theme, what Nigel was saying about this economic political divide, I think the events of the last year have sort of finally buried what used to be sort of the orthodoxy really of the 1990s and the 2000s, that by opening up to economic liberalisation, political liberalisation would inevitably follow. And what we saw instead was the sort of economic liberalisation and development of both China and Russia made them immensely powerful. In fact, put Russia in a position where it was, able to, or felt able to launch this war while essentially blackmailing particularly Europe over energy supplies.
Yeah. I would just add that if anything, Russia has become more isolated as this war has worn on, and countries that initially abstained, for example, in the United Nations votes, are now beginning to vote against Russia. A sort of point of comparison here, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union could always rely on a reasonable rump of countries to support it diplomatically in other ways. There's almost no one now. Belarus, Myanmar, one or two others.
Eritrea, North Korea.
North Korea, very important.
It's quite a roll call of...
Yeah. But the really big countries as well, China and also Modi, India's Prime Minister, a couple of weeks ago, also at the Samarkand summit, publicly saying to Putin, we're unhappy with this. And he said, I told you many times on the phone. Again, he's saying that to Putin's face. It's really striking. The other part of this sort of international story is the strength and resilience of Western resolve. And this is something that could not have been assumed. I think the West has surprised itself to some degree, and certainly something that Putin has underestimated. He expected that on that economic home front, resolve would crumble. And that hasn't happened. It's not just a matter of states. Every Western government, plus important Asian allies, except Hungary, you sort of have to say, but also civil society, emphatically now. You see Ukrainian flags everywhere across Europe. There's no significant body of opinion that is yet saying, we have to look at things from a Russian point of view. We have to sort of reconsider this. It's this unanimity. And also, and absolutely unprecedentedly, and most surprisingly, the private sector has not just complied with sanctions, because it has to, because it's the law. They've amplified sanctions voluntarily. They have, many Western companies, including some very important ones that Russia is dependent on, have chosen to suspend their operations with Russia. Didn't have to do that. That's absolutely new.
Yeah.
Do you think that Russia, how much do you think Russia needs this support from Beijing, from China, from India, like from these places that it kind of assumed that perhaps that support, albeit quietly, would remain? How much does it need that kind of support from?
There is a view increasingly that Russia is the Millwall of international relations.
Like Liz Truss in British politics has also got the same designation. Yeah.
No one likes us, we don't care. So, of course, it's nice to have diplomatic support that it really no longer has. On more substantial matters like helping Russia to evade Western sanctions, which are very, very significant and serious, and about to become much more so when the EU's oil embargo and its price capping plan kick in December. Russia would have hoped for forms of help, ways around that. If anything, we've seen the opposite. We've seen China actually deterred by the fear of incurring Western sanctions itself from helping Russia. Yes, it's buying some of its oil and making pragmatic use of that. But the larger story is that no one really wants to touch Russia very much anymore. And they all want the war to end. I think if you ask China, and this has been their view for many months, they'd much rather this war had never begun in the first place.
And just to ask briefly, I mean, you talked about the kind of broad support there has been. I guess there's two ways that could, by one, telling a rupture. One is Italy, and whether you see any danger of that happening. And I suppose the other is just there's been sort of some noise around maybe Germany not providing arms in the way that it might have been expected to, and some reluctance there. Do you see any of that, especially as we get towards winter? Do you see, and as everybody knows, gas prices and everything else, do you see any kind of possible splits and all of that?
It can't be taken for granted, and there may be bumps ahead. The first signs from the new Italian Prime Minister are actually encouraging. She has tweeted to President Zelensky warmly, and that's been reciprocated. So far, she's on message in terms of the collective EU position. Germany, well, it's sort of fashionable to sort of find fault with Germany, and certainly there are problems with its Russia policy up to the invasion itself. The Germans have been very candidly, almost disarmingly, kind of acknowledging of that and said, yes, we made mistakes. You know, our policy was mistaken. Since then, I think if you judge countries by how far they've come in their Russia policy since the beginning of the invasion, not many countries have done better than Germany. This is absolutely a historic shift. The big election to worry about, if we're looking for cracks, is in America in 2 years' time. That's the one.
Mm-hmm. You made a similar point to me the other day. I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this would have all turned out very differently. I don't think anyone disputes if there had been someone else in the White House, you know, particularly had Trump got a second term. And, you know, it's clear that this is, you know, Biden's commitment to Ukraine is a very kind of deeply held and personal one. You know, having watched his administration's failings, deep and profound failings in Afghanistan, I think, you know, a foreign policy issue where I think they got so many things wrong. You know, Ukraine is somewhere where actually they've done very well, and I think you can see, you know, Biden just has never shown any apparent interest in Afghanistan. I mean, he was asked about the withdrawal on the 4th of July last year and said, "Oh, don't ask me about that. It's a holiday. I want to talk about happy things." And then you look at how he talks about Ukraine and what's happening there, and you can see that that is a deep and personal commitment from the most powerful man in the world. And yeah, I would agree. If that changes, then if the war is still going on, that is potentially could be very worrying.
Well, look, I think a final question for you both, and then we'll move on to questions from people watching. It's just, we are obviously at the beginning of winter, and it's a moment that people have been nervous about for a long time. It feels like things have just moved an enormous amount recently. When we come to the end of winter, what do you think the situation in Ukraine will look like? And Nigel, can I ask you that first?
Well, on the home front, I think if Europe in particular can get through this first winter, the first winter will be the hardest because Europe will be learning how to adapt and adjust to what we expect will be a cutting off of Russian gas. Every future winter will be easier. So in terms of the role of time in all this, the winter is a crunch point on the Western Resolve. On the battlefield, I think if Ukraine can capitalize on its recent gains, continue to push back aggressively before these large numbers of, yes, less well-trained, less well-equipped, but they will come in large numbers, additional Russian forces, then we could be in very different and much, for Ukraine and its supporters, much more encouraging territory. But I don't think it will have ended by then.
I do not think I have the military expertise to make predictions. I would agree that sadly it won't have ended. I would say just a couple of things. One is that, you know, people have been talking a lot about the impact of winter on Ukrainian forces, but Russian forces, who are less well equipped, have longer, more complicated and clearly much less functional supply lines, are going to be living through the same winter and trying to fight through the same winter. So, you know, and Ukrainians said to me last winter, admittedly the war began towards the end of winter, so they didn't live through the bitterness of it. And perhaps somewhere where climate change helped, last winter was a particularly mild one. I don't know what the forecasts are for this year, but they said, you know, we are in our houses. We are, you know, the Russians are sort of out looking for support, trying, you know, the Ukrainians, so they have better resources on that front to at least be a little bit more sheltered. And I would just say that pretty much at every stage of this war, Ukrainians have surprised the West, including their very close allies. You know, Zelensky surprised everybody by not leaving. The Ukrainians surprised everybody by holding Kyiv. Then, you know, the sort of, I would say that the consensus among many people in August was that the war had settled into a bit of a stalemate, and it's very hard to do offensive operations, and that because the Russians were so dug in the south, that Ukrainian attempt to reclaim its territory would effectively be an offensive operation. And then they took this, you know, there was this absolutely stunning lightning advance that, you know, we've seen what it absolutely put Putin completely on the back foot. So I would say, yes, you know, there are very, very serious challenges in the form of winter, this onslaught of new fighters from the Russian side. But I think it would be, at this point, a bit foolish and sort of conspicuously kind of blind to underestimate both Ukrainian resolve and their ability to surprise people and take advantage of what they have in terms of weapons and morale and everything.
More Western weapons coming.
Yeah, and every time they succeed, I mean, you see every time they have a military success, they get more weapons, essentially. You know, they get, after Kyiv, they started getting this longer range artilleries. After their successes, they've been getting even longer range. You know, so clearly each success is begetting more military support. Perhaps one big worry to flag up is our own military-industrial complex ability to supply. You know, we're running low on our stocks, and that is a concern. Is the West doing enough to sort of ramp up production of what Ukraine needs?
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. We're going to pivot to questions. So thank you so much to both our first edition readers and the live audience who've been sending questions in. If you're just joining us, remember you can ask Emma and Nigel any questions by just leaving a comment below or on Twitter using the hashtag FELive. So we're going to start off with a question that has been sent to us from a reader. Giles asked, what could the West do to respond to a tactical nuclear offensive from Russia?
It's quite a terrifying question from
We
Giles
start hard.
Okay.
Nigel, do you want to start?
Yeah. judge the probability of Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons to still be low, but it's higher than it was, as other options begin to fall away for Putin, and he is presented with a starker choice over time between withdrawing, abandoning his objectives, and using the most extreme means available to him. There are other unorthodox things he could do. I'll just mention briefly the mischief with the two Nord Stream pipelines, the mysterious sabotage of that, it's not only about gas, it's a sign that Russia can do the same thing with data cables, for example, which are the nerves, essentially, that connect the world. So watch that sort of thing, too. But back to nuclear weapons. And as I mentioned earlier, there have been private warnings conveyed to Moscow in recent days. I think it's very unlikely that we'd see an in-kind response. I don't think anyone is talking about Western retaliatory use of nuclear weapons if Russia were to confine an attack to Ukraine. It's a range of other things that are available to the West, and they would include, for example, potentially conventional attacks on Russian territory, particularly targeting the military assets that are responsible for the launching of a nuclear weapon. In addition to that, cyber. It's a dog that hasn't barked really on either side. Yes, there were some limited cyber attacks by Russia against Ukrainian institutions in the days leading up to the invasion. But Russia's much vaunted power in that domain has not manifested itself. And similarly, the West has not yet carried out the sort of pretty devastating cyber attacks that it could. And we understand that Russia's cyber defenses are much weaker than the West's on average. So those are the sorts of things, a range of very serious escalatory but non-nuclear responses.
Emma, can I ask you, this is a question from Matt, and he asks, to what extent should we offer Putin a route to a face-saving climb down to diffuse this situation, or are we now resigned to relying on something internal happening in Russia? And I suppose, you know, you've followed lots of conflicts, the sort of end game of getting out of this sort of situation, the idea that you can't humiliate him, he can't be allowed to lose too badly. Is that a credible idea or not? What do you think?
I mean, I find that a very odd position to be starting from. You know, yes, I understand the need for realpolitik in difficult situations, but, you know, clearly part of the reason, as I said, we're in this situation is because of, I would argue, a failure to respond to previous aggressions by Putin, you know, both in his own backyard and further afield in Syria. And also, I mean, people talk about needing to save face and to prevent him being humiliated. I mean, he tried to take Kyiv. He had supposedly the most powerful, you know, military, bar the America, one of the world's most powerful militaries. You know, his military has been humiliated in many ways, first in failing to take Kyiv, then in failing to, you know, being kicked out of Kharkiv, failing to achieve what it wanted. You know, arguably you could say that the terrible, terrible human tragedy of Mariupol was another humiliation for Russia. You know, it was one city that they were only able to take after months and months after resorting to the most vicious, brutal pulverizing of the entire place, you know. He's already been massively humiliated. I find that an argument that to me just doesn't make sense. I don't know what Nigel thinks.
Face-saving, well, if you offer Putin a face-saving option that you don't have to, the implication is that there are alternatives available, then you're choosing that option because you're more afraid of something else, into nuclear territory and scenarios. It remains, in my view, unconditionally irrational for Putin to use nuclear weapons. In a sense, we shouldn't be afraid to win. I think that's the worry here. And as Emma suggested, a face-saving outcome, it would be only an interim outcome. If it left Russia in any way better off than it was before the invasion began, it's effectively a reward for that aggression. There is no guarantee whatsoever that that would be the end of the matter. There's no reason to trust Russia's word whatever on this, and that it would in due course be the prelude to a third invasion after those of 2014 and happened 2022, because there's no evidence fundamentally that Putin and those closest to him have given up their original primary goals, which is to subordinate all of Ukraine. And in terms, they have reiterated that objective in recent months. And again, such is Putin's deep personal psychological obsession. He's not going to scale back from that. A face-saving outcome would not be a solution. It would not be stable. And in addition to that, of course, we know from the war crimes what that means for Ukrainians. Face-saving outcome doesn't just mean territory. It means human lives as well.
Right.
We know how they're treated.
I mean, the other part of Matt's question, which I'm sure you get asked quite a lot, is whether there is any prospect of an internal coup, of Putin's removal, anything like that. I mean, would we even know if that was the case? Is there any kind of information system that would tell us?
Coups typically surprise those who fall victim to them. They don't predict them. It's therefore much harder for outsiders to predict them. So, I mean, there is fun pundit territory about, whether someone will show up with a bullet in a gun or something.
Right.
I think what we can more confidently say is that the system overall is under much greater strain, is being tested much more severely than ever before. And that's not only a matter of growing discontent, alarm about the personal consequences of the war from below, as we were discussing earlier. An authoritarian regimes like this one, change almost always begins from within and not from below. And elites, those around Putin who sort of matter some way to the system, their center of gravity, I believe, has long been against this war, that most of them were privately very unhappy when this began. They are best placed to fully understand the longer-term consequences for Russia and themselves of this in the rounds, not only military ones, but the effects of sanctions, including on their personal wealth. I think for that reason, if whether for physiological or political reasons, Putin were to leave the scene, I suspect this war would actually end quite quickly. It's not a sure thing. You can imagine another hardliner succeeding them, but if it were a coup of some kind, then as a consequence of unhappiness with the war, it's very unlikely that another hardliner would replace Putin. It would be someone else who would end the war and its consequences quite soon.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's been sort of tacit deals between the Chinese government and the Russian government, with its population, particularly the elites, stay out of politics and you can get rich. And that whole deal has kind of been destroyed by this war because their sort of wealth has been affected, their ability to operate. So.
And just, I think probably the last question, because time has flown by, is from Nicholas, who is asking about the Nord Stream pipeline and the leaks and potential for sabotage. He says, I don't quite get who benefits from this. Wondering what degree of technological knowledge is necessary to put explosives near pipes at sea depths and detonate them.
Who did it? Basically.
Yeah, basically that's what he's asking. Is it a terrorist, an autonomous terrorist organization, another state? Is it Russia? We obviously don't know, but yeah.
I think the smart money is on Russia. And it's partly another way of signaling to Europe its dependence on Russian gas. But in addition to that, there's read across to the vulnerability of other forms of connectivity that run across the seabed. If you're looking at weak points of the West, and therefore lateral moves that Russia might make, short of escalation that crosses that nuclear threshold, then watch what happens to the world's data cables. There is the nervous system of the world, and Russia has the means to disrupt those seriously. So I think this is a signal.
Okay. Have you got anything on the data cables?
I think Nigel's summed up a complicated thing very well. I'm happy to leave it to him.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much indeed. It was really great to have you. And that is the end of our conversation tonight. So thank you very much for tuning in for this and for all your questions. Most importantly, thanks to Emma and Nigel for such a fascinating conversation.
If you've enjoyed this live event, please do subscribe to The Guardian's first edition newsletter. It'll give you the same insight from reporters and experts every morning in your inbox at 7 a.m. And also, don't forget to subscribe to Guardian Live. That's it for this evening. Thanks so much and see you next time.